Welcome back to All About Winning Daily Fantasy Sports. My name is Ty Patton. A common myth is to punt to tight end defense special teams positions if need be so that you can use the extra salary to spend up for other positions. Although the tight end defense special teams positions scoring is fairly disproportionate in comparison to the other positions, each position in your lineup is worth 11% of your total score. That is why I'm not willing to punt any position. I will admit that these positions have a lot of variance from week to week, but there are a few numbers that are fantasy relevant that can give you an edge, which is all we are looking for. No matter what type of contest you're in, you're looking for that edge. Before we unpack this week's players to target, I want to take a quick look back at week 10. The top five projected tight ends going into week 10 were as follows: Travis Kelce, Hooper from Atlanta, Andrews from Baltimore, Cooks from New Orleans, and Ebron from Indianapolis. The actual top five scoring tight ends were as follows: Andrews, who scored 23.30 fantasy points, Kelce, who scored 20.50 fantasy points, Olsen, who scored 17.80 fantasy points, Everett from the Rams, 14.80 fantasy points, and Howard from Tampa Bay, who scored 14.70 fantasy points. Now, another thing that I do with the tight end positions is I try to factor in ownership. And if people are spending down, I might spend up. If people are spending up, I might spend down. And that's one way that I try to gain leverage on the field, no matter what type of contests I'm using. And then I factor in some other things, which we're getting ready to talk about. But there's a lot of variance with the tight end position, and it sometimes seems impossible to get right. But if you do your homework, it'll definitely help you out and help you gain an edge on the field. These top five tight ends had a total of 44 targets, which averages out to 8.8 per tight end. They averaged 18.22 fantasy points, and this comes out to 2.41 fantasy points per target. Now, for me, I prefer to target tight ends that, the things that I use, I look at targets, I look at matchups, I look at red zone targets, and I consider the value. Oftentimes, when I'm stacking, the tight end will also be a part of my stack. I very seldom like to use a tight end in the flex position. I've done it a few times. It's not my preference. I prefer to use a running back in that position. But there's sometimes in really good matchups for tight ends that I'll consider doing that. There are a few teams, such as Arizona, who has a DVP of 32 versus a tight end, and Tampa Bay, who has a DVP of 31 versus a tight end. These are the teams that you like to target with the tight end. I also am interested in tight ends that are with rookie quarterbacks or backup quarterbacks. Oftentimes, tight ends run shorter routes and they're a safety valve for the quarterback. So those are some things that I factor in as well. And I also like to, if I know a lot about the defense, if a defensive team is known to blitz a lot, I tend to like to target that team as well. It's quarterback trying to get rid of the ball really fast. With all these things in mind, these are the tight ends I'm targeting in week 11 and why. I encourage you to follow along with this chart that I've developed. I've broken it down into a few categories that I'll go over with you real quick. First off, the colors, obviously, red is the worst, yellow is middle of the road, green is the best. And this is in comparison for each category. Obviously, Mark Andrews isn't a bad tight end. This just his salary in comparison to the other lower salaries is bad. He's 6,100. You go over in the next category, he's getting 7.3 targets per game, and that's why it's in green. That's one of the higher ones. And the categories that I'm looking at are targets per game, fantasy points per game. How many fantasy points does the opponent give up to the tight end? What that team's DVP is against the tight end, and how many red zone targets the tight end is getting. Those are the things that I like to use to factor in my tight end. So without further ado, these are the tight ends that I'm going to be targeting in week 11. Mark Andrews, he's getting 7.3 targets per game. He's averaging 14.6 fantasy points per game. He's the top spend up option on the main slate. Other salaries make it difficult to get to the Andrews for the other positions, but he is one of the top weapons for Jackson. And Jackson's one of the quarterbacks that I don't mind going in and running him without a target. He's one of the few quarterbacks that possibly the only quarterback that I'm willing to do that with. But Andrews is one of his top targets, and if I can get to him, I'll use him. This is not a great matchup. Um, Houston's number 9 versus the tight end position, so it's not great. But he seems to be matchup proof. It's just how much are they going to try to get the ball to him, and obviously Houston doesn't funnel the ball to tight ends like some other teams do. And the 6,100 is kind of steep with the, as I mentioned, with the other prices on this weekend slate. Next up, Darren Waller, 5,500. He's getting 7.2 targets per game, scoring 14.9 fantasy points per game, which is the highest on this slate. Cincinnati's only given up 9.6 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. They have a DVP against the tight end, pretty much middle of the road, 15. He's received seven red zone targets. He gets a high volume of target. This is a high game total, which makes Waller viable. Could be contrarian if the consensus is spending down at the tight end position. If people are trying to get a lot of salary to spend up at other spots by spending down for some of these other positions, Waller's ownership might actually be a lot lower. And he's $600 less than Andrews, and I like the game script as well. I think Cincinnati is going to be competitive in this game, and Carr has showed a propensity to go to Waller a lot. So I definitely like Waller. If I can get up to him, I'll have more of him than I will Andrews. Next up, Jared Cook. He's 4,400. Pretty close to middle of the road as far as salary, but still kind of high because he's getting 5.3 targets per game, 8.2 fantasy, scoring 8.2 fantasy points per game. Tampa Bay is second worst against the tight end. They're giving up 14.9 fantasy points per game to the tight end, and they have a DVP of 31. He's only received 4 red zone targets. There's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. He did get 10 targets last week in the loss to Atlanta, and as I mentioned, Tampa Bay's 31 DVP versus tight end, and they do funnel a lot of targets to tight end position. So obviously he's a little bit easier to get to than the other top options. To get values is kind of scary, right around 15 points. And the scary part about the offense is all the mouths that Drew Brees has to feed. So I'll have some shares of him. Not sure how much. I'm going to be looking at ownership. I'm thinking his ownership might be a little bit higher due to recency bias last week, and obviously he's considerably cheaper than the other top options. Greg Olsen, I got him in yellow. I'm kind of on the fence with Olsen. He's 3,900. He's getting 6.1 targets per game, scoring 10.3 fantasy points per game. Atlanta's given up 10 points per game to the tight end position. They have a 17 DVP versus the tight end. He's only had 5 red zone targets, and this is another team that has a lot of mouths to feed. He did get targeted 10 times in the game last week versus Green Bay, but that was a negative game script. They were behind. I'm not sure they're going to be behind in this game, and when that's the case, you see a heavy dose of McCaffrey. McCaffrey's half the offense, so there's only 50% of the rest of the offense to go around to Olsen and the other receivers that they have. I do like that price. One of the early ownerships that I've seen, though, he was fairly high, and that's going to be caused by the amount of targets that he received last week. I got him on the fence, but I'm probably going to change that to green for the lineup building. Next up, Eric Ebron. He's 3,600. He's receiving 4.8 targets per game, scoring 7.9 fantasy points per game. Jacksonville's given up 9.8 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. They have a number 16 DVP versus the tight end. He's had 9 red zone targets. The problem I have with Ebron is kind of like a running back committee. This is a tight end committee. But Ebron is coming off a 12 target game last week, which that is kind of scary. I don't want to chase points, but he should still have a large target share due to Hilton being out, Campbell being out, and Funches being out. So Ebron and Doyle are the main targets by default, but I just feel like I might be chasing points with him. And last year he did have a pretty good run with touchdowns. He's not getting that this year with his. He's only averaging that 7.9 fantasy points per game. But he's definitely viable at 3,600. Doesn't take much to pay off value for that. And I will have some shares of Eric Ebron. Next up, TJ Hawkinson from Detroit. He's $3,600. He's getting 4.9 targets per game. He's scoring 8.3 fantasy points per game. Really hasn't had a really good game since the very first game, kind of when he broke out in his rookie campaign this year. But Dallas has given up 12.9 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. They have a number 29 DVP versus the tight end position. And Hawkinson has received 7 red zone targets. Dallas does funnel targets to the tight end position. Driscoll's going to be playing backup quarterback. Could see a situation where he's going to look to Hawkinson as a safety valve often. Dallas's cornerbacks, as I mentioned, due to their ability to lock down the outside, they do force a lot of targets to the tight end. And this is setting up real nice. It's got a 49.5 point, 47.5 point game total. It is a backup quarterback, but he did throw the ball 46 times last week. And I think Hawkinson is going to get targeted a lot in this game. And I think there's going to be some points on the board. Next up, Ross DeWilly from San Francisco. He's 3,400. He's only he's getting 1.8 targets per game. He's scoring 1.7 fantasy points per game. He's playing the worst team versus defense. They're giving up 17.6 fantasy points per game to the tight end. A DVP of 32. DeWilly's had 1 target in the red zone. This is the free spot. The matchup that you always have to consider is the tight end versus Arizona. It's just been the thing to go to since they do funnel targets to the tight end. And the thing with DeWilly is I'm not sure how much San Fran's going to have to throw the ball with Breida being out, or he's doubtful, but I'm pretty sure he's going to be out. I'm thinking this is going to be another Coleman game. And I don't know how much San Francisco is going to have to actually come out throwing. They just played this team a couple weeks ago. It was a fairly close game. San Francisco's coming off their first loss. They like to run the ball and they like to play defense. And I think they're going to get back to that. I have my concerns with DeWilly. I think he'll be popular because of his salary, and he's going to be popular because everyone knows that you play the tight end that's playing against Arizona. So, but I will have some shares of him, not as many as some of the others, but a small percentage. Last, and certainly not least, he's actually one of my favorite, is Tyler Eifert this week. He's $3,200. He's getting 4.2 targets per game. He's scoring 6.5 fantasy points per game. He was on the receiving end of Finley's first touchdown pass last week versus Baltimore. Oakland's given up 13.1 fantasy points per game to the tight end position. They have a number 30 DVP versus the tight end, so third worst in the NFL. He's had 8 red zone targets. I really like this matchup with Oakland giving up what they do to the tight end. This is a rookie quarterback in his second start on the road. I can see he's a really accurate passer. I don't know that he's going to have time to stand and wait for outside routes and other things to develop. But I could see him checking down Eifert, and he did go to him for his very first touchdown. So I have a lot of interest in Eifert. I like that price. It's not a punt by any means, but I will have a lot of shares of Eifert. And the 3,200 actually lets me spend up at other spots legitly without just going down and finding someone that's starting and 2,700 and hoping they get a few catches or maybe stumble into the end zone. So there you have it. These are the tight ends that I'm targeting. I'm going to sum them up for you one more time. Andrews, Darren Waller, Jared Cook, Olsen, Ebron, Hawkinson, DeWilly, and Eifert. Now I want to identify the defensive special teams I'm going to target in week 11. And I'll give you the reason why. I don't have a chart for that. I haven't come up with one how I want to break it down. Defense special teams have a lot of variance from week to week. I generally limit mine to 3 or 4. I have a few more this week that I'm interested in. I do like to focus on home teams that are favorites. I like the big favorites because if they're going to be winning by a lot, not that I expect them to pitch a shutout, but if they're winning by a lot, that forces the other team to put the ball in the air to try to catch up. And when the ball has to go in the air, that creates all kinds of things that lead to defense fantasy points, sacks, sack fumbles, interceptions, pick six, and all those things that happen. So these are the defense special teams I'm going to be targeting in week 11 and why. Number 1, San Francisco. They're 4,000, the most expensive on the slate. They're a home favorite. I generally don't like to go up to 4,000 for a defense. There's been a few times this year, New England, for instance, who's scored, in the 30s. As a matter of fact, they're averaging like 25 fantasy points per game defense there for a while. I normally don't like to go up that high because that's a position salary, but 4,000 is doable. They're home. It's 44.5 point over and under. Rookie quarterback. They run a lot of plays, fast pace. That's what they want to do. If they get behind, they're definitely going to have to throw the ball. San Francisco has a very stingy pass defense, and I just like the opportunities that are going to be there for them to score some defensive fantasy points. They should be good and angry coming off a loss to Seattle on Monday night on the national stage, and I think they want to focus on getting back to their winning ways. And if I can get up to the 4,000, Draftkings did a really good job on their salaries this week. But if I can get up to the 4,000, I will definitely be looking at San Francisco for one of my defenses. Next up is Buffalo. They're 3,800 at Miami. They're the number 3 defense in the NFL. They, this has been the thing for the first few weeks, except the last 2 weeks. Miami's won 2 games in a row somehow. But the thing early in the season was to play the defense that's playing against Miami. And Buffalo is a very good defense, and they're on the road. That's the one drawback. But they're a favorite on the road. I think they're going to give them all kinds of problems. Miami doesn't have that many weapons that you have to really worry about. I think it'll be a lower scoring game, but I think Buffalo will definitely impose their will. They're a couple $100 less than San Francisco and might have a little bit less ownership. And that's one of the big things that I consider as well on my defenses is the overall ownership. Next up, Dallas. They're 3,600. They're another road favorite playing against Driscoll, who's the backup. And I see Dallas getting a lead in this game, and I believe that this will obviously force Detroit to the air. Now, Driscoll could be looking at this as an audition, and like I said, he did put the ball in the air 46 times last week in a losing effort. But I think that Dallas has a really good pass rush. They'll get some pressure on him, maybe create some erratic throws, a couple picks, and I think that it won't be hard for them to get the value at 3,600. Next up is Minnesota. And I like pairing. I do oftentimes like pairing my defense with the running back, and I have a lot of interest in Ezekiel Elliott. And it's not just because this Dallas Cowboy jersey. I've mentioned this. I guess I should give you my disclaimer. I've been a Dallas Cowboy fan since 1977, but when it comes to the bank account, I have no problem being unbiased. So I feel like it gives me an edge being a fan. I'm pretty much in tune with their strengths and weaknesses, and don't let the jersey scare you away. I do have a small interest, as I said, in their defense this week, but there's some other options that I like a little bit better. But if it's there, it just makes sense with the backup quarterback, and those are the situations that I like and look for in the defense special teams. Next up, Minnesota. This is probably my favorite. They're 3,400. Home favorite, backup quarterback in his second start. He's been in the league a few years, but this is his second start. First one on the road. Going to be a really tough matchup. Minnesota likes to put a lot of pressure on the quarterback, and if they get out and get a lead, I can see them pinning their ears back and going after this guy, Allen. I don't know a whole lot about him, but I think this is going to be a very, very difficult task for Minnesota. And as I mentioned when I was talking about Dallas, teaming up the defense with Elliott, I oftentimes like to do that defense with the running back, correlate them. Dalvin Cook and this defense makes a lot of sense in lineups this weekend, and they're my favorite, and I'll have more shares of them than any of the other defenses that I'm interested in. Next defense I'm interested in is Oakland. They're only 3,300. They're going to have real low ownership. I think they're really sneaky. They're playing against the rookie quarterback Finley. I think Finley will play better this week, but he did have a pick six and a fumble for a touchdown last week in Baltimore. Baltimore's defense actually outscored Cincinnati's offense. So he's a rookie. This is his first road start. He does have some weapons. He doesn't have AJ Green, but neither did Andy Dalton. But I think this is a difficult matchup, especially if it starts to become a shootout, and the more times he puts the ball in the air, the more likely some bad things can happen. Oakland's been playing very well this year. They're at home, and I think this is a difficult spot for a rookie quarterback. One of the good things about him coming out of college is they talked about his accuracy, but that wasn't evident last week in some of the throws that he did make. Like I said, I do think he'll play better, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's more mistakes his second start in the NFL. Next is Carolina. They're 3,000. I think there's going to be low ownership due to recency bias for Atlanta, as well as Atlanta played last week, and the way they moved the ball on New Orleans. I think that'll be scare people away from Carolina. Plus, Carolina is they give up a lot of fantasy points to the running back position, but Atlanta has had some games this year where they just absolutely bombed on offense and turning the ball over, and I wouldn't be surprised at all to see them coming off that big win against New Orleans and fall flat on their face in Carolina and just get handled pretty good there in Carolina. Carolina's defense has been scoring a lot of fantasy points per game. I believe it's 9.8. They've been at 9.8 fantasy points per game, and they've been averaging 4 sacks per game. So, and with sacks comes all kinds of possibilities. So I'm definitely interested in Carolina as a home favorite. Last and certainly not least, and I don't normally do this, and I guess this would be considered a punt. Arizona, they're 1,500. Um, Takes 7.5 points for them to hit 5 times value at 1,500. So this is super risky. It does allow you to spend way up for other positions, or makes salary available to you. I might do this in a couple lineups. Like I said, it doesn't take much at all to get decent value, and that's what the name of this game is value. And so definitely have to consider them. It's risky, but it is tempting. And those are the defenses that I'm going to be targeting in week 11. So summing up my defense special teams, I will be targeting San Francisco, Buffalo, Dallas, Minnesota, Oakland, Carolina, and Arizona. As I mentioned, I usually only have 4 defense special teams that I like to target, and I like to focus on the home teams and teams that are bigger favorites, just because of what that creates, game script possibilities. So if I narrowed it down, my top 4 targets this week would be San Francisco, Minnesota, Oakland, and Carolina. I want to thank you guys for joining me. I encourage you to please post any comments or opinions that you may have below. It really helps me out if you share this video, like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell. I really appreciate that. Some of my viewers have subscribed, and my subscriptions are trending upwards. That really helps me out a lot, and I really appreciate that. I'll be coming back here shortly with lineup building, where we're going to put all this together from my videos this week, build some lineups for tomorrow, show you some lineups that I built with Optimizer, put a nice big bow on it, and put it under the money tree tomorrow. Again, my name is Ty Patton. This is all about winning daily fantasy sports, and I'll be back real short. Thanks.